Welcome, everyone. Today, we're discussing how network latency affects Ethereum validator revenue, and specifically what a 100 millisecond improvement can mean at scale. I'm joined by Moritz, research engineer at Optimum, and Sajida, chief product officer. They are two of the co-authors of a research piece Optimum published recently, along with Slobodan, our chief economist, and CEO Muriel. Optimizing a $100 billion market, effects of latency reduction on ETH staking revenue. Let's start with the big picture. Why should validators care about network latency? Isn't it mostly about good hardware and reliable uptime? Maybe Moritz, you can kick us off.
Yeah, Ken, that's actually an excellent question, right? In a sense, hardware optimization is really important for staking revenue. However, hardware and uptime are basically table stakes. So most validator operators have already figured that part out. Latency is a different problem, right? Because when a validator proposes a block, for example, it has to traverse the Ethereum P2P layer before other validators can attest to it. So how fast that happens basically determines and constrains how much time a validator can use inside the slot. And it's outside of the control of this respective validator, basically. Now, propose too early, for example, you leave something on the table. Propose too late, and your block arrives too late at other validators to attest to it. Latency is the constraint that determines the outcome in that sense. And we wanted to basically find out how that constraint translates into different APRs for different validator operators.
Awesome. Right, so I guess for the audience's sake, it's important to give some context that as a validator, most of the time you are attesting to others' proposal. And so 99% of the time you're a tester, and then sometimes you're selected as the proposer, or sometimes people call it leader of that particular block or slot, and you're proposing. Right, so at any point in time, you're playing one of the two roles. So what I heard you said, Moritz, is that this constraints, that is latency, really exists at the network level. It's outside of what any individual validator can solve, right? So Sajida, is that where Optimum comes in?
Right. So yeah, this is not something that operators can directly configure. Right, you can choose your Ethereum client, you can select which relay to connect to, you can try to optimize on the infra provider selection, all that to achieve better performance, because that's in your control. But as a validator, you cannot do anything about how fast a block propagates through the Ethereum peer-to-peer layer. It's a shared infrastructure. And that's where Optimum comes in. With MemP2P protocol, validators just have to run a simple sidecar that we call a gateway attached to their beacon node. That allowed them to tap into the MemP2P propagation boost. And basically, you have the Optimum network running in parallel of the existing peer-to-peer network. It doesn't need to replace it, it complements it. Operators that we have testing Optimum on Hoodie right now gets their block faster via MemP2P than libP2P over 80% of the time, which is a significant edge. In the pilot, we're providing real-time propagation metric for both the Gossip Sub baseline and the MemP2P. So operators can measure the advantage directly. Obviously, getting the performance results was an interesting milestone to unlock, but it also brings up another interesting question, which is what this research is about. If you improve propagation latency on Ethereum, what does that actually mean for validator APR? So that's what we're here to discuss.
All right, that's some interesting observation there, Sajida. So let's talk about scale. Right, the research that you have put out really put this in the context of a $100 billion staking market for Ethereum. So maybe you can give us a sense of the landscape, right? What are the validators actually optimizing for here?
Yeah, okay, let's jump into it. Maybe we can share a quick diagram that will help us illustrate. What is important to understand is that validator APR has two components. On one side, you have the consensus layer rewards from attestation, block proposals, and on the other end, you have the execution layer rewards that come from fees, builders payment. Both are sensitive to propagation latency, but through different mechanisms. So on the consensus side, as we said, faster block arrival means more accurate and timely attestation. So you're able to capture the rewards that you are supposed to have as part of your validator operation because you increase your performance and because of the latency reduction. And then on the execution side, it's a slightly different mechanism where you are able to leverage extra slot time to access better beats and better visibility into the MEV market.
So it sounds like whether you are a proposer or a tester, there are different mechanisms for you to make extra staking yield. And the staking yield, as we know, don't just come from vacuum, right? They actually come from these very solid underlying mechanisms that are kind of built in to the protocol, and some of it are out of protocol strictly by definition. But no matter which one it comes from, the key thing to remember is that speed matters, right? So how we're seeing it is really like there's really that one thing, that speed is money. So Moritz, what does that actually mean in practice for an operator's bottom line as we look at translating speed into money?
Yes. So this is the golden question, right? The research that we've done suggests that very small improvements in latency, meaning very, very small improvements in latency, basically already translate into measurable outcomes or into significant outcomes, like 50 to 150 milliseconds of extra slot time by being 50 or 150 milliseconds faster when proposing or receiving a block, translate already roughly into 1 to 2% higher revenue for validator operators. Now, that is based on like an historical analysis that we did across the biggest validator operators out there, which represent approximately 1/3 of the total stake. And from the analysis that we did, that the relationship is approximately linear, right? So we have 50 milliseconds translating into roughly half the improvement that 100 milliseconds would do. And 50 milliseconds translate approximately into 0.75% more revenue for the operator, which is already really significant, right?
Very interesting. Very interesting. So long story short, right? Every 50 millisecond, that's almost 1% improvement in revenue. So if we can translate, if we can deliver a 100 millisecond improvement, that's almost doubling that 2% revenue. As you mentioned, the relationship is roughly linear, right? So this is a very interesting observation, and I think most people may not be familiar with that, right? So maybe you can walk us through the methodology, or Sajida, where does this data actually come from?
Maybe we can mention the main sources that we used here. So we have three main external sources. Zatu, which is the telemetry database that the ETH Ops team has put in place with many contributors from the ecosystem. That was very useful. That gave us timestamped data on when blocks are first seen by nodes across that network. And then we use the rated API to track the APR for validator operator. So that gave us the economic signal to correlate it against. And the third data sample we used was the bit traces we collected from major relays, PBS relays over a week. And with all of that, knowing the MUM-P2P advantage that I explained earlier, we were measuring with our partners that translate basically into the extra usable slot time that Optimum provides. Then we're just able to see what's the correlation between that delta of improvement and the economic side. So the way we get that delta is for each gateway, we have a dual pass measurement. We record for each node the gossip sub and the MUM-P2P arrival timestamps. So we have the baseline to compare against under the same condition, and we're able to do an apple-to-apple comparison. So yeah, that's the sort of data landscape that we were operating within. Maybe Moritz can add to that.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So effectively, we are seeing a parallel example of a two-path measurement, and
yes,
they happen under the same condition. Right? So it's really apple-to-apple comparison. And we also look at three different independent data sources that are all talking about the same question. And that would actually bring another interesting question to me, right? Like how do you go from latency data to an APR estimate now that we can compare and see the gap in latency, how does that translate into how much more money we can help people make? Maybe Moritz, you can help us share some thoughts.
So the proxy that we took, sort of the invariant in the network, is the P80 latency. So this means how long does it take for a block to reach 80% of the network. With this being our main metric, we can say if we improve the P80 latency by 50, 100, or 150 milliseconds, a proposer has the equivalent budget in time to additional time to propose a block, like additional usable slot time, which, according to the relationship we described earlier, historically speaking, translate into additional revenue for the validator operator.
So that's very interesting sharing on the translation of speed into money. Again, I think that's probably the most important part here. So let's really dive in, right? So with MonPeer-to-P delivering 2 to 3x faster block propagation on the Ethereum Huli testnet currently live on production, let's unpack that and think about what actually propagation in Ethereum means and what do people do and what happens behind the scenes when Ethereum is really kind of running, right? So behind the scenes, right, there are all these blocks that are moving when the proposer has to actually propose the block, and before that it gets selected, right? Every couple epoch ahead. So and proposer gets selected depending on how much Ethereum stake it has, and then it propose that vote. That block will need to travel through the network all over the world to reach other validators. They will need to receive it in time and vote on it, depending on whether it's a good block or a bad block. So they will vote yes on the good block and vote no on the bad block. Long story short, and that vote will again travel, throughout the world to reach the vote aggregators. So on and so forth. There are so many rounds of like these, blocks. They're traveling, votes are traveling, and it makes the whole network extremely latency sensitive. So knowing that as a context, right, it then kind of helps people explain why Ethereum itself has established voting accuracy, and you have to vote on time, on target, to be able to help you earn reward as a validator. So that's what people generally call the consensus layer reward. And so Moritz, as we look into the research, how does that break down in practice in how Optimum helps improve the consensus layer reward for validators?
This is very important now. So the consensus layer rewards are actually, and specifically the vote rewards that you just shared, they are composed of two aspects. It's like, one, does a validator itself get the vote right? And two, do other validators get the vote right? So in a sense, if only I get my vote on the right block, but everyone else votes on another block, that doesn't translate into higher revenue for me. But it's like it's a network-wide. It's a network-wide effect, and an improved network performance also helps an individual validator in that sense. Now, the most fragile vote out of these votes is the so-called head vote, meaning the vote on the last block, and it currently sits at around 98.6%. Now, we have seen that across the network with 100 to 150 millisecond latency improvement, we can already roughly halve the gap between the 99.6% and a theoretical upper bound of 98.6% to a theoretical upper bound of 99.4%. The 99.4% is due to the missed slots in the protocol, which make the vote on the last block redundant. Now, this is the effect that an additional 150 millisecond improvement can have on the consensus layer rewards. And this eventually, across the network, translates into 1,000 to 2,000 ETH more network revenue.
Very interesting. So around 2,000 extra ETH revenue, right, for all the validators to share, and eventually can be shared back with the stakers that stake with them. So these are significant money that are left on the table, basically not captured by anybody just because the network is slow these days. So that's really fantastic on the consensus layer side. So as we kind of explored before, when we look at the chart, the APR is broken down into the consensus layer side and the execution layer side. So let's now talk about the execution layer side. It happens only when the validator is proposing, and all the execution layer reward goes to the proposer, which is one party for that particular block, right? So Sajida, maybe you can help us understand, as Optimum provides these speed benefit, how does that translate into value for this particular proposer for that particular block, and kind of how this works as the proposer rotate from block to block, and effectively how this translates into APR improvement for all the validators that are using Optimum.
Right. So on the execution layer side, things are a bit different. That's where MEV comes in. So the way it works under the PBS model is that as a validator, you're running a sidecar, you're getting bids from builders through the relays. You're selecting the one that is the most advantageous. And once you commit to it, the relay are going to package the payload, and then the broadcast happens and the block gets published. And then the race begins, that the blocks get seen by a good share of the network before the 4-second deadlines that you're not getting reorged. So the tension here is that you need to select your bid and ultimately trigger the publication of the block in time so that you don't miss that 4-second deadline. If you do it too early, you might be selecting, as we can see here in the diagram, each dot here is a bid. You might be selecting a bid of a lower value, though it would be safer for your deadline. If you do it too late, you might be accessing a bit of a higher value, but will you make the deadline in time? So that's the sort of dilemma that a proposer face. Why is this interesting? In the sample that we collected, we were able to see that the uplift can go as high as 30 to 16%, which is quite meaningful. And even though being a proposer is a rarer event and duty compared to the attester, over a fleet of validators that most of the big operators operate, it gets statistically meaningful. And even more interesting, due to the volatility of MEV, some slots can see up to 20 times higher bid if you're able to leverage that extra slot time to select a more efficient bid. So there is a very significant portion of the pie here that could be made accessible to the operators and to all of the stakers and people working with them.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that there's a bidding system that's going through live. And some of the audience might have heard of the term PBS, which stands for proposer builder separation. So there are these builders that are building the blocks that gets pushed to these proposers that are basically receiving the bids from the builders, right? And assessing and checking which bid they will commit to. And indeed, it's this extra time that we give them as advantage because they can afford to now select the bid a little bit later, so they can select the more profitable bid on average compared to before. And that is really the key unlock here. And I really like that explanation. It really brings out this nuance really well, so which is on the execution layer side. And this bid, it translates into extra APR. And people may know of this from other terms. For example, MEV is really what we're talking about here. Like the bid value and the MEV is really interconnected, right? So the more time that you have basically allows you to also achieve a higher MEV from here that eventually you can distribute with your stakers.
Yeah, and I think what's important here also is that you're allowed to optimize for your bid selection while maintaining the safety, like within the constraints of the protocol. So it is not about adding more risk. It's really about unlocking for the operators extra usable slot time that was not accessible before, allowing them to make, better, more optimized decision.
Right. So expanding the opportunity, space for them to
exactly.
play with. So let's wrap up. Love to hear one takeaway from each of you. During the research, is there what was the most unexpected finding? So Moritz, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, that's a good question. For me at least, the most interesting finding was we expected there to be a lot of potential on the execution layer side due to the mechanism described by Sajida. What surprised me the most was how much there is to gain on the consensus layer side. Right, when we talk about the vote accuracy already being at 98.6% already on average, you wouldn't expect there to be 1,000 to 2,000 ETH gain potential in the whole network. And this sheer fact was one of the most surprising things to me.
Interesting. So this extra 2,000 ETH, additional for annual network revenue, it's really a major unlock. Sajida, what surprised you?
First of all, I think it was easier to reason about the execution layer side, right? Because you have all those bit traces, so you can always say what would have happened if I had, an extra 50, 100 millisecond. So that was very interesting from an analysis standpoint. And then what we saw is how heavy the tail was on the MEV side, which is often something that is considered a downside because of the volatility. But another way to see it is how much of upside there is to unlock here. As I mentioned, some, the most optimal bid that, might have been 50 milliseconds later could be up to 20 times the bid that was selected. So I think this is non-negligible and really speak directly to the core, business priority to a lot of the operators. I think over the sample that we collected, roughly $400,000 due to bid uplift could be unlocked for all of the proposer within that time frame. So yeah, pretty interesting results.
Great. So it's a really fantastic discussion. Again, the full blog post that many of the results were presented and the ETH research paper can be both found in the description. So thank you both, Moritz. Thank you, Sajida. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to this episode. And we'll see you in the next one.